Hello, everybody. Welcome to this evening's final series in our digital webinars in the lead up to the No One Place Forum, which is happening this Thursday and Friday in Dumfries. It's really brilliant to have you all join us. It's been really exciting seeing all the different people we've had in these spaces and exploring some of these themes of creative placemaking with us. We're talking about creative placemaking and looking at some of the things that make that up. Creative placemaking being a community-led approach that uses creative activity to support collective decision-making and positive change for the people and the places that they live. Like I said, this is something we've been exploring at the Stove, and it's something we wanted to explore with as many people as possible through these sessions. We bring it into our work and into our approach, and we see a lot of other people bringing it into their work as well, and are really interested to hear from other people about how that works for them. The main themes that we've been exploring in this are space, physical and conversational, people and power, communities, creative practice, and society and activism. And tonight, of course, we're talking about communities. Some of the questions that we've been thinking about in this is how do you build with the experiences and knowledge that are present in our places and bring new skills in a way that adds to what is already there? How are multiple voices heard and represented in decision making? Who is accountable to whom? And many more things that I know DJ will get us all thinking about tonight. So we're really delighted to have DJ join us. DJ is local to Dumfries and Galloway, a creative community development consultant and an activist with over 25 years experience of grassroots delivery in youth and community development. Tonight, they'll be talking to us about their experiences in using creative, radical approaches that ensure effective, meaningful and impactful community engagement and development, working with underrepresented and disadvantaged communities, multidisciplinary practices, and just the joys of connecting with people and place. So welcome, DJ, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for coming back after last week's little incident. I shall just get this screen shared. Okay, so tonight I've been asked to work through from a presentation like that is pretty much focused around about working with communities. I'm an instigator, I'm a community development practitioner, I'm a creative practitioner, I'm an educator, I'm a learner, I'm a time traveller, I'm an agitator, and I'm a storyteller. And most fundamentally in all of that is the fact that I'm a bit of a proud Gallovidian, and exactly like Kat was just saying, I'm a Doonhamer through and through. I'm born and bred here, so I've been living and breathing and working in my own local area for well 30 years as a practitioner. So I'm just going to go through what I've been asked to do tonight. So we'll set the expectations up. So the ask was, what nourishes and grows community? How do we build with the experiences and the knowledge that are present in our places and bring in the new skills in a way that benefits and adds to what's already there? How are multiple voices represented, heard and represented in decision making? And who is accountable to whom? So not that the Cat asked too much, like there was only 8 points, you know. So for 40 minutes, like it's going to be a whistle stop tour. So I've also been asked to discuss my experiences in using creative radical approaches that ensure effective, meaningful and impactful engagement and community development, working with underrepresented groups, multidisciplinary practice, and the joys of connecting with place. So I'm going to try and do that as holistically as possible and use examples as I go of my work that has covered, that will cover the majority of these points. So why me? Because the Stovies are cheeky and like to pull me in whenever they can. No, I have a very, very long history of like, well, it's over 10 years now, working with the Stovies in a variety of different contexts. I was initially brought in thanks to Mr. Matt Baker just before they moved into the building. I had just was in the process of leaving Dumfries and Galloway Council, where I had been delivering professional community development for just over 20 years. Because I'm born and bred here, I'm quite well connected, so the networks that I have are quite robust and quite varied right across the region. I also went to art college. I studied photography and was using that as a means initially when I came back to Dumfries, as a way of looking at how people felt about the time. So actually, before sort of creative placemaking became the latest in buzzwords, it was something that was just happening naturally anyway. We were looking at the places, we were using different creative techniques to explore how we felt about Dumfries, because it was a very different beast back then. So that's like 30 years ago plus. Because I was born and bred locally, I also knew what all the pitfalls were. I grew up here being queer and quite with very few role models in a community that felt quite hostile. It was very rural. I was pretty much feeling isolated for the majority of my teens, and I knew that there was something about Dumfries that kept me grounded here, which I'll come back later to. But knew that I needed to get away for a little while, so I developed my art practice, and then wanted to use it back in my hometown to work out what could be done to try and improve the place that I was born in, and to try and put something back that would allow me to other people to not have to go through some of the experiences that I'd gone through with regards to support and having an atmosphere and an environment round about me that was a lot more inclusive and welcoming. So needless to say, that led me on to doing some activism. During my teens, I was doing all sorts of anti-Nazi league activity over the UK. I was doing lots of volunteering, looking at different methodologies of using what I'd learned at art college and putting into practice. So I was working with like women's aid groups and using my creative practice as a way of sort of allowing people to process their experiences and to come together to explore that. I eventually ended up sort of working in residential children care and child care units, which was pretty intense because it was a secure unit. Yet again, I found the creative practice coming out and using it as a mechanism for young people to explore the issues that had affected their lives. So that became the foundations of what was to be my future career. I then took on a job at Dumfries and Galloway Council and ran the Youth Inquiry Service and took over the shell of the building that at the time was the Oasis Youth Centre, which they were trying to close it down at the time. There was nothing in it, and we could see it had a huge potential as a space to be utilised with different creative practices to engage young people. So this was mid-90s, so there wasn't too much of that going on, but we used the space because it was quite a redundant space, but we could see what it could do. So we started to use the empty spaces as a workshop space for theatre. We were putting interactive exhibitions on it. This was very early doors of sort of decks being available. So we ran some DJing workshops, and that was like so newfangled for the backwater of Dumfries. And we were using this mechanism of the Oasis Youth Centre as an empty space that we could put activities on, and the purpose of the Youth Inquiry Service, which was very much more about issue-based practice and looking at issues that were coming from the community, from young people, and trying to find different ways of communicating with that. So this is almost like, I mean, the internet was about, but it was not widely accessible. It was heavily leaflet based, but there was a limit to that. And we had a sexual health clinic based with us, because we had some of the highest STD rates in the country at the time, and highest teenage pregnancy rates. We had amongst the highest in Europe young suicide rates. There was just an absolute epidemic of all sorts of things affecting the young people at the time. And we tried to set out to create more opportunities and more activities that could engage these young people at Dumfries. And we went about that through our creative practice and using the Oasis Youth Centre as a mechanism for doing that. So that became quite a successful approach, and we started to then develop this little creative community out of this old sort of derelict building that, well, they were ready to close. But because it was quite successful, because community had engaged with it, young people were feeling quite, there's nothing in it, but they were feeling the ownership of the space, because what they had been allowed to do, how they were able to come together, the opportunities they were being met with, meant that we'd inadvertently created this little army of young people that, when they heard that this building was about to be closed, didn't like that. So they gathered, and they did what turned into a long process of constantly trying to save youth services. So they gathered, and they became Dumfries Youth Activists. And they, over many, many years, there was different incarnations of them. They were called the Yes Army, there was Dumfries Youth Activists. And there was a huge period of time where, because the young people had finally found, they hadn't had anything like this, they had finally found their place. They'd finally found a building that they could own. They had finally found people that they could talk to and that were taking them seriously, and that they were working in real partnership with to challenge some of the powers that be that were just wanting to take these buildings away. So this became, and the next part of my practice was round about supporting young activists. At the time, Section 28, Section 2A was still alive and kicking, so there was a bit of an issue because we were within Dumfries and Galloway Council's education department as youth work at the time. So I wasn't actually allowed to be working with local LGBTQ young people. And well, that wasn't happening because as someone who was queer myself, young people seemed to be flocking, because here I was living out and proud in Dumfries, and they were flocking for support. And there was nowhere else to go at the time. So they were coming in the Youth Inquiry Service and really owning that space, because it was finally a safe space that they could be in. So the atmosphere, the environment that we created, the way that we worked with them, created a service that is still enduring to this day. At the time, it wasn't even allowed to have a name. It was undercover. I was threatened with my job. But over the next few years, Section 2A was repealed, and we were able to do the work more publicly. And then we teamed up with LGBT Scotland. And as I say, that's now, so that was 1996, and the Phoenix Youth Group is still running, and LGBT Youth Scotland is still running in Dumfries. The Oasis Youth Centre is still running in Dumfries. The Youth Inquiry Service is still running in Dumfries. They're amongst the longest running, most established youth work services in Scotland now. I went on to set up my own company, because after 21 years working within the council and lots of culture shifts there, it was time for me to get out, because I wasn't being as effective as I could anymore. I'd gone much further up the ladder, and the usual story management meant that I was not getting any time to do what I loved most, and that was working directly with the community. I am very much grassroots, boots on the ground, sleeves up. I can do all the rest of it. I can do the budget management, I can do the project management, I can do the funding bids, but that's not where my heart and soul was. So I finally set up Sleeping Giants, and it turned into a kick. It was a community interest company. It's still running. And then I moved on to my current incarnation, which is the Imaginarium. And that's all about looking at the possibilities that we have to explore together, and the change that can be made from that. So as you can probably hear from the way that I'm talking about it, it's not just work for me, it's my ikigai, it's my life purpose, it's my raison d'etre, and it flows through every part of my being. As a proud Gallowaydian in Doonhamer, anything that I can do for my place, my sense of belonging is so strong here, and I know how important that is to so many other people, and how we cultivate a sense of pride in our place is fundamental to a lot of health and well-being issues, particularly around about mental health and well-being. So that's a very long story as to why me. So some of the things that I wanted to sort of throw up straight off is, in order to harness the transformational power of professional community development practice, we need to take a few things into account. So when I talk about professional community development practice, I'm talking about the big community development practice, like the training, and not just the small CD. It's a noun, it's not a verb. You know, it's not a name, it's not a title of a service. It's a doing word. You know, we go out into communities. We don't just have a label. We go and we get our hands dirty. We get in amongst it. We become part of the process. So yeah, I'm always very struck about the fact that it's so easy to just use the terminology, but it is actually it's a verb, and we need to get out there and constantly be doing in order to achieve the outcomes that we all so passionately believe in. It's the difference between delivering a service and being of service. It's a science, because when we study community development, you start to see that it's all about sociology. It's all about different levels of predictability in people. It's about sets of practices that you can put in place that will respond to those predictabilities. It's about an art form as well as that science. We're balancing both. We're using the different ways of the different creative approaches that we can have, and the different methodologies that we know that we can bring out of our toolbox to be of the most effective use as part of that journey with a community. And there is that spectrum of delivery, because it is absolutely across the board. There's lots of debates around about the fact about whether you like for it to be specifically youth and community engagement and development work, about whether people have to choose to be there. So is youth work in prisons, is that actually youth work? You know, there's all sorts of conversations around about that, and when people choose to participate, that is one of the fundamentals I'm about to talk about. When they choose to participate, when it is of interest to them, that's where the success lies. So it's about also being clear what your role and your responsibility and the expectations are when you're delivering with a community. So professional community development practices, and I'm very conscious there's a lot of creatives and artists out there that we know this whole spectrum of socially engaged practice, and the different ways that we approach it. I'm speaking tonight very much from my professional community development practice point of view, and it just is one end of the spectrum of how we can deliver. So there's lots of different participatory practices. We know I rely quite heavily on participatory appraisal methodologies, which were created in Africa, and the reason I really lean heavily in that direction is because the purpose of those exercises and methodologies were very much about being able to communicate, make decisions, work in partnership with local communities with very little resource. So it was utterly accessible no matter where you were, whether you were in the city, whether you were out in the desert, wherever you were, you could work directly. It was about very low level. It's not about fancy £1,000 toolkits or anything. They're all very simple, straightforward exercises, but they facilitate lots of discussion, which is the key to this. So knowing when to use the different methodologies and approaches, it's always about seeking social justice. It's reflective. There is management aspects of it come in quite heavily, particularly if you're involved in the more service-led ends of things. We have to think very critically, and there's always an emphasis around about conflict resolution. The joys of communities, they regularly, constantly go through the whole process of forming, norming, storming, performing. And to be able to help them go through that and even know that that's just a process that's part of their journey, and it is enabling if it's approached in the right way. It's solution focused, and it's very much based around about sociology and understanding people. So yeah, we community development for a very long time, I think it's on a later slide, was referred to as the Cinderella service, because we mopped up everything round about everybody else. And it wasn't until the sector was professionalised, maybe about 15 12, 15 years ago that people started to realise the actual weight that community development and youth work carried, the difference that it made, and they started to quantify that in monetary terms. The course is now 4 years, it used to be 3 years. It is very rigid set of frameworks around about how we develop and deliver our practice. The ethics, the values, the principles and the practices are drilled into us because it's really fundamental. There is a Standards Council, as a Community Learning Development Standards Council, and we have national occupational standards that outline and define how we practice. And that includes calling out when it's not being done well. So the reason I've got that is to say that we are very professionally trained in order to be able to go into communities. And I know a lot of people that sort of do the small c and the small p struggle with lots of the dynamics, etc. within communities. That is just part of what we study. You know, it's a whole plethora of different things that we bring to the table. And I think the professionalisation of the sector really has started to show how important it is and the value that we can bring to loads of different other aspects of society. So our underpinning ideologies are like, well, these are the majority, like there are various other ones. These are the ones that absolutely underpin my practice, but that we are introduced to very early on in our training. So Paulo Freire and the pedagogy of the oppressed, the development of critical consciousness, and Saul Alinsky's rules for radicals. So I think that probably says everything about the fact that I've already said that I'm an activist. And these two books in particular are ones that really define the practices that we can bring to help enable change within communities. And they are tried and tested methods that they've been going since the sort of 50s, 60s. They're absolutely robust. It is community organising. Paulo Freire is a Brazilian educator and philosopher. There's schools all over the world, and it's his ideologies round about education no longer being just a banking method, but actually about how we learn together, about how there isn't a teacher. It's not a teacher and a learner. We're all learners. We're just facilitating at different points. We're there to learn together. And the different mechanisms that I'll come on to it in the next slide, that he put into place are solid, the absolute solid foundations of how we as practitioners in the West deliver our community development. So if you've not come across the Paulo Freire Pedagogy of the Oppressed or any of his other works, then it's definitely worth checking that out. And here we go. I've just popped in a couple of quick slides. Paulo, a couple of quick diagrams rather, just to sort of exemplify them, so that because they are quite critical to every part of our practice and how everything is absolutely needs-led and how robust these things are. My entire career has been based around about using these rules, and it works every time. So Freirean ideologies are based around about dialogue. That is the absolute cornerstone of everything that we do, and creating the right environment, having the right spaces available with the right atmosphere in them is absolutely critical to how we converse together, and the dialogue and the quality of the dialogue that we are able to have. And that is where the transformative change begins, because at that point, people who are particularly so very much Freire's work was very much about enabling the poor to rise up and affect their own change within society. That was absolutely his focus. Saul Alinsky's focus was about pretty much the same. So it is very much about social justice issues. It's very much framed around about inclusion. It's absolutely all the foundations that I've already described for community development, principles, practices, the dialogue and the atmosphere. And I hope that you can read that, or I'm sure this will be shared at a later stage if not. But principles round about love, humility, having faith in the process, having hope, and building up to that critical thinking part. So the top of the pedagogy, like the journey with the pedagogy, not the top, because it's actually a journey, is about achieving a place of critical consciousness where people have sat down, they've learned together. It's about offering up problem-based provocations. That's about how do we solve this? Individuals' ideas, they come up with the solutions and working with it together so that that community themselves come up with their own solutions, and that bolsters a real sense of ownership around about the process. It's always based around about issues that are of interest to them because it's personal to their being. And this is when the different types of communities come together. So communities of interest, communities of geography, the theme, the narrative of what is being discussed and what the problem, the provocation is, what problems are looking to be solved, is the thread that keeps that there. And the way that we behave together in those spaces, the love, humility, the faith, the hope, and the critical, moving towards the critical thinking, that's the key. That's absolutely the key. Encouraging and enabling that atmosphere is fundamental to the success of any work in communities. And you can, the Saul Alinsky list there is tactics for then taking on the next part, because once you get people in communities to a place where they feel enabled to start to change their life and the transformative change agenda begins, you also need a structure within which to then tackle the powers that be and the imbalance that they will be feeling, and like moving things forward. Saul Alinsky's talking about change and how you really tackle an authoritarian society out there, and it's very, very, very pointed and has never really changed. It's all pretty predictable. It goes back to the predictable issues and the predictability of community and the predictability of society and the change, the mechanisms that we need to put in place, the allies that we need to encounter, the critical friends we need on board, the strategies we need to put in place, how we address the power balances, the different mechanisms of participation ways. These two sort of talk us through those sort of elements of community development, the fundamentals for me. So when we're a community development practitioner, when we're working with communities, we as the conduit, we as the empty vessel, because that's what Freire talks about, is we're pretty much the empty vessel. We just are there as part of the process. We don't have a power dynamic in this. We are just there to help facilitate and enable. And I think it was Adrian the other week was talking about an accompanist. That's absolutely perfect term for it. As that practitioner, one of the things that we have to be most aware of are the influences and the inhibitors that we have surrounding our practice. We have to be aware of the landscape of practice that we're sitting in. We have to think about the ethics, our accountability, privileges we have, our own ego, the power dynamics at play, putting together a sort of mechanism that allows a shared purpose, a shared language to come online, to allow there to be that safety within that the dynamic that you have created with the communities. You have to be very reflective. You have to be a competent, effective practitioner to be able to hold all of that, and that comes not only through training but time and practice and working with people. And the other thing is, again, back to the Cinderella service, what we do is very often completely undermined. I remember on a regular basis, people would say, you just sit in that youth centre with your feet up and drinking tea and coffee and chatting to people. Yes, I do. That's because the dialogue that we create, the atmosphere that we create, that is where we create the change. That's where it begins. That's where we start to weave it. So just some examples of some of the work that I've undertaken that has been very much needs-led. As with all our practice, it's only ever successful that way around, it only ever is impactful that way around. So I spoke earlier about sort of the Yes and the Oasis Youth Centre. I mean, it went from that shell that I was discussing to being so valued by the local community, particularly the young people who had campaigned for it, that we ended up with hundreds and thousands of pounds worth of funding that now will be an exorbitant amount of funding that has gone into the Oasis. And it's fully functioning as a real creative hub for young people. It's got recording studios, rehearsal studios in it. It's got cafe space in it. It's got training rooms in it. It's got stages in it. It's got all sorts of different activity-based provision there. And the Youth Inquiry Service is still up and running. And through some of the when we initially created this space for young local creatives to come together, it was the first time that had happened. And because it was so fresh, it brought out such creativity in these young folk. And we have had some very successful young people that have now gone on to international acclaim, including a certain Mr. Calvin Harris, who used to come in and use the recording studio at the Oasis. You know, we created then that creative community that's actually still really tight. 20 years later, they're all still in touch with each other and creating something. We've got an international opera singer, we've got lots of sort of pop singers and DJs and a huge wealth of young folk that went on to sort of develop their own festivals and their own sound systems and all sorts of different things. So we created this community, this creative community of young folk that were musicians and music producers. So that went on to the live events development, which meant that we ended up creating Youth Beats, which is now a 2-day free. It's the largest 2-day free festival for young folk with youth music in Europe, I believe. And I think it's probably more now, but there was like 12,000 attendees. And one of the big things that came out of that was that it had got to a point that young folk, I saw the narrative change, because we were doing this and we were getting, way back in the day, it was like N-dubs, this was the big thing, headlining, and that sense of, oh, something good's now happening in Dumfries, oh, there's somewhere good to go, oh, I can actually be myself here, I can express myself here. That sense of belonging and that sense of pride really then fed in. You could see it over the sort of last 20 years, sort of, to the development of a real shift in the community towards valuing creativity more and more opportunities, increasing the sort of youth music scene, and we were running all sorts of theatre workshops and stuff as well. But that sort of embedded more of a creative community in the town that is now absolutely flourishing. LGBT Youth Scotland I spoke about. Roots of Celebration of Cultures came out of need for some awareness around about different cultures. We, like, whenever the young folk turned up in the Youth Inquiry Service one day and said that they'd read this really horrible letter that had been submitted to the local newspaper talking about a young person that had moved to the area and they didn't feel in the slightest bit included. And
that's 5 minutes, Debs.
All right, okay, I better zip through this. Well, effectively, the end of that slide is just to say all of these were needs-led. There was a need to challenge some racism in town. There was a need to challenge some cuts that were happening in town. We made a Mad Hatter's Tea Party happen. Everything was done with a creative approach. We took over the council gathering. We created a Doonham roller derby because local young women were saying that they needed something more empowering for them to come together on. Hidden histories, we used history. You can see here loads of different techniques at use and approaches to engage communities and to really push that sense of place and a sense of belonging. So what nourishes and grows communities, I think I sort of spoke about along the way, about the fact that coming together, creating spaces, being able to talk and have dialogue and find the commonality in their existence is a big part of that. How do you build the experiences and knowledge present in our places and bring in new skills in a way that benefits and adds what's already there? Again, it's about creating the right spaces, the right environment, delivering in the right way, whether it's themed, whether it's creative, but just creating that environment. Multiple voices being heard and represented in decision making, again, speak to the people, create a dialogue, ask them, work with them. You're the facilitator, you're the learner, you are there to enable and open up opportunities, and about ensuring that that is very much from them, and you can help them enable that. Who's accountable? Everyone's accountable. You're accountable to each other, and the future of our communities. So I was going to talk a little bit here just about co-creation, because that's kind of where we're going with this, is that creative placemaking relies on the intersection of practice, and co-creation needs a commonality of language in the same way that working with directly just with a community group does as well. Everyone needs that commonality there, a clear shared response, responses and participatory practices that allows different people to come in different ways at different times. The devolvement of power and engendering trust, which can only come really through time, are the fundamentals for building those really strong foundations for delivering. How we behave in the world matters, like, because the other part of, I would imagine quite a few is here, you're involved in organisations and the establishment of organisations and the development of organisations. How we set those organisations up, those groups up, doing that in a way that actually allows a ripple effect, like internally, allowing that CLD practice to radiate out from the beginning of that, from the middle of that, from the ethics and the standards and the principles that we all believe in around about social justice, and allowing people different ways and to be involved, and allowing transformative change to be part of what we do from the inside out. That's intrinsically aligned. Integrity, congruence, authenticity, trust and transparency, I think, is the key to everything. And we're all just walking each other home, shoulder to shoulder, you know, we're in it together. I'm done. That's the one of the most fundamental quotes that I've held on in my entire career. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful and committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Margaret Mead. And yeah, it comes back to quality, not just quantity, and ensuring that when groups come together, even if it is a handful, if they work in the right way, huge transformative change can happen.
Amazing, and perfectly on time.
Oh, well, you're normally running late. I don't believe it. I think you're being kind, Kat.
No, it's 6:43.
Wow.
Amazing. That was just a really brilliant presentation, and I think it bookended Adrian's talk in the series absolutely brilliantly. I've sort of got bristles on the back of my neck. Yeah, like, I think talking about creative placemaking is something that was happening anyway. You know, I think that's where it's like, that's fundamental. It doesn't matter about the terminology. It's actually like, what's the work we're actually talking about? And I think, you know, you pretty much embody what I'm talking about, certainly when I talk about it, but what I think the Stove is talking about it, in terms of that way of working with communities and creativity. It's been a real pleasure to explore that with you. I love the way you talked about the process that allowed young people to feel ownership of a space, particularly talking about some of the projects and the Oasis, and working with very little resource, and how important it was to be able to deliver in a very limited environment, because it's about social justice and the values of the work, and the real need for connection and the building of trust right at the very beginning, I think, can often be forgotten when something is made more formalized sometimes, you know. And I think you said enabling the poor to rise up and affect their own change. So I think it's like how you embody and keep that activism alive is really evident in the way you talk about your work. Yeah, so I mean, just brilliant, really, really great. Thank you.